Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is July 7, 2024, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's an honor to welcome in discussion members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. As always, to contribute your thoughts to our discussion today, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom, and for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. So that everyone has a chance to speak, I'll call you in the order that hands are raised, using first name only. Once we finish recording in 2 hours, I invite anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So this is our 12th meeting on Plato's last and longest dialogue, The Laws, and today we're looking at Book 11, which I have to admit I struggle greatly with on the first few readings. It's a curious and sometimes downright annoying book, in which, true to form, the Athenian dominates the discussion as he reels off 33 laws to regulate trading and commerce in Crete's new colony, Magnesia. As we know, disputes over property are among the most divisive, and in some cases, the penalties in the Athenians' laws include death, while in other cases he prescribes whippings and beatings, which don't even require a court order and can be administered by a passerby who witnesses an action he thinks not virtuous. Slaves and women receive particularly harsh treatment in the Athenians' laws, which struck me as shocking given his earlier enlightened positions that slaves and women should be treated as equals. The Book 11 is especially jarring because it follows Book 10, where we began our series on the laws 12 episodes ago. On my first few readings, I found Book 11 particularly upsetting because its predecessor, Book 10, I find to be, quite frankly, sublime. Recall that in Book 10, the Athenian uses the physics of motion to prove the existence of the gods, and that, as humans, we share in the same capacity for self-generating motion that the universe has. Self-generating motion is unlike the motion of any physical object. The motions of all physical objects require a cause, and as we now know, are subject to entropy. But self-generating motion requires no external cause. Entropy guarantees that physical objects aren't capable of self-generating motion, but both the soul and the universe, as the Athenian says, are defined by the expression self-generating motion. So as it's described in Book 10, the motions of our souls, like the motion of the universe, are their own cause, their own derivative. And I find this is an incredibly empowering way to think about our human souls. In Book 10, the Athenian further establishes that reason is far older than the physical universe, and as such, reason is the central core of the universe and is the cause of all physical things. Our minds have a capacity for reason. As Plato often puts it, we use reason to moderate the often conflicting demands of need and desire. And I find it very comforting to think that my mind, like yours, has the ability to reach into the core of the universe in that way, to exercise reason which is beyond the grasp of anything physical. So what's up in Book 11? What's Plato's dramatic purpose with a sudden sharp shift in tone from Book 10? So after several readings, what I discovered to be most intriguing in Book 11 is the reaction, or lack of reaction, by Clinias to the onerous laws that the Athenian expounds. Remember that Clinias, who is from Crete, is to be among the first leaders of the new colony of Magnesia. It seems as if, in Book 11, the Athenian is putting Clinias to a test of leadership and is examining particularly Clinias's ability to apply reason after such lengthy discussions and convincing sounding expositions. It's a test that Clinias doesn't appear to do well in. He doesn't challenge the Athenian on the many contradictions to reason that are presented as laws. He doesn't defend the basis of the colony's laws and virtue, or recognize the dangers to harmony that are evident in the Athenians' laws. It's almost as if the Athenian, like the foreign sailors discussed in Book 4, has invaded the structure of Magnesia and is able to return to Athens after having made his impression without having to face the consequences. As one of the colony's first leaders, however, Clinias is the one who will have to face the music, and he does not display the spirit and sense of justice necessary to counter the Athenians' contradictions. So Magnesia will be off to a shaky start, I fear, and I'm beginning to wonder whether the government of Crete deliberately placed Clinias in discussion with two foreigners, including Megillus from Sparta, as a test of his mettle before handing over the reins of Magnesia and allowing him to be the midwife to the colony's birth. So I'll start today's session by reading some of these apparent contradictions to see what you think of them. I'd like to know, too, that if you were in Clinias's shoes and were able to establish laws for a brand new colony, what your first law would be. And I want to know more than just this. I want to know the reasons for your first law. And whether you agree with what we heard the Athenians say 2 weeks ago at the end of Book 9 from 874d to 875d, that, quote, the first difficulty is to realize that the proper object of true political skill is not the interest of private individuals, but the common good. This is what knits a state together, whereas private interests make it disintegrate. And that was the end of that quote. So let me share some of these contrasts. And what I did in the notes, which are posted to the share drive link to the event notice on meetup.com, is I put the contrast. So I started the first one, I put a short section from book 8, from 805a to b, and then I'll put the contrasting statement of the Athenian from book 11. So in book 7, 805a to b, the Athenian says, I maintain that if these results can be achieved, the state of affairs in our corner of Greece, where men and women do not have a common purpose and do not throw all their energies into the same activities, is absolutely stupid. Almost every state, under present conditions, is only half a state and develops only half its potentialities, whereas with the same cost and effort, it could double its achievement. Yet what a staggering blunder for a legislator to make. So I remember when we discussed book 7, that just really came across as very, very enlightened. Women and men are the same. And then we get to book 11 at 917a. And this is what I call the absence of reason contrast. So at 917a, the Athenian says, now the superiors of bad men are the good, and of their young, their elders, bracket usually, which means that parents are the superiors of their offspring. Men are, bracket of course, the superiors of women and children, and rulers of their subjects. All these people in positions of authority deserve the respect of us all, and the authorities of the state deserve it in particular. And then he goes on at book 11 at 925a. And in all cases where a man leaves only female offspring, the succession is to pass through the family according to the same rules of kinship. Through brothers and sisters' sons, the males in any one generation always taking precedence over the females. So I thought that one was particularly jarring, that contrast. I'll read another, this is a lengthier part from book 10, which I talked about a few moments ago. This is book 10, 896a, 897b. And this is where the Athenian sets out the nature of the soul. And this is what I found very compelling in book 10. And then we'll get to a contrasting part in book 11. So this was where the Athenian starts. So what's the definition of the thing we call the soul? Surely we can do nothing but use our formula of a moment ago, motion capable of moving itself. Clinias responds, do you mean that the entity which we call the soul is precisely that which is defined by the expression self-generating motion? The Athenian says, I do. And if this is true, are we still dissatisfied? Haven't we got ourselves a satisfactory proof that soul is identical with the original source of the generation and motion of all past, present, and future things and their contraries? After all, it has been shown to be the cause of all change and motion in everything. But when one thing is put in motion by another, it is never thereby endowed with the power of independent self-movement. Such derived motion will therefore come second, or as far down the list as you fancy relegating it, being a mere change in matter that quite literally has no soul. So it was an equally correct final and complete statement of truth when we said that soul is prior to matter, and that matter came later and takes second place. Soul is the master, and matter its natural subject. Clinias agrees. He says that's absolutely true. The Athenian says the next step is to remember our earlier admission that if soul were shown to be older than matter, the spiritual order of things would be older than the material. Clinias agrees again. He says, certainly. The Athenian says, so habits, custom, will, calculation, right opinion, diligence, and memory will be prior creations to material length, breadth, depth, and strength, if, as is true, soul is prior to matter? Unavoidably, Clinias says. The Athenian continues, and the next unavoidable admission, seeing that we are going to posit soul as the cause of all things, will be that it is the cause of good and evil, beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice, and all the opposites. Clinias again agrees, of course. The Athenian continues, and surely it's necessary to assert that as soul resides and keeps control everywhere where anything is moved, it controls the heavens as well. Clinias says, naturally. One soul or more than one, the Athenian asks. I'll answer for you both. More than one. At any rate, we must not assume fewer than two, that which does good and that which has the opposite capacity. Clinias says, that's absolutely right. The Athenian says, very well then, so soul, by virtue of its own motion, stirs into movement everything in the heavens and on earth and in the sea. The names of the motions of soul are wish, reflection, diligence, counsel, opinion true and false, joy and grief, cheerfulness and fear, love and hate. Soul also uses all related or initiating motions which take over the secondary movements of matter and stimulate everything to increase or diminish, separate or combine, with the accompanying heat and cold, heaviness and lightness, roughness and smoothness, white and black, bitter and sweet. These are the instruments soul uses, whether it cleaves to divine reason, soul itself being, if truth were told, a divinity, and guides everything to an appropriate and successful conclusion, or allies itself with unreason and produces completely opposite results. So that's where the Athenian talks about really this divine value of the soul. Now, here in Book 11, 916a to D, he presents a very different view of soul. He presents souls as chattels, things that can be traded. He's talking about the trading of slaves. From 916a to D, if someone sells a slave suffering from consumption or stone or strangury or the so-called sacred disease, which means epilepsy, and if the purchase was made by a doctor or trainer, or if the facts were pointed out before the time of sale, the buyer shall have no right to return him to the vendor. But if a layman has sold such a slave by a professional, the purchaser may return him within 6 months, except in the case of the sacred disease, when the period for restitution is to be extended to a year. The case should be heard before a bench of 3 doctors appointed by joint nomination of the parties, and if the vendor loses, he must pay twice the selling price. If a layman sells to a layman, there should be a right of restitution and a hearing as in the previous instance, but the loser should pay only the simple price. If the slave is a murderer and both buyer and seller are aware of the fact, there should be no right of restitution for the purchase. But if the buyer acted in ignorance, he shall have a right of restitution as soon as he realizes the situation. And the case should be tried before the 5 youngest guardians of the laws. If the vendor is judged to have known the facts, he must purify the house of the buyer under the expounder's rules and pay him 3 times the price. Maybe I'll just break there and ask for your comments, what your thoughts are. That part that I just read, I mean, are there any reasons given for these rules that he's putting in place for the buying and selling of people? And do you see this contrast? And do we see Clinias in Book 11 responding? Do we see Clinias saying, well, where's the reason for that, Mr. Athenian? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. Now, recall that, as I said in the introduction, that Clinias is to be one of the first leaders of the new colony. And so he's going to be setting the very foundation of the colony's laws. And the foundation requires solidity to make sure that the colony is going to survive and thrive over time. So is Clinias, by not challenging the Athenian on this, is he actually going to be capable of providing that solid foundation for things that maybe have not been anticipated? Did anybody see anything else in Book 11 that was particularly compelling, especially in contrast to the other books? All this handing out of punishments and whippings and lashings. And Fred, your thoughts? And then Darren.
A whole lot of do's and don'ts here in Book 11. Lots of rules to maintain social order. It reminds me as much as anything as the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible, which goes on and on and on about things you can do and punishments meted out if you don't follow the social code. If you borrow your neighbor's mule and don't give it back, then you're punished by paying twice as much for the mule. If you kill your neighbor's mule by mistake, you have to replace the neighbor's mule. If you use the neighbor's slave, then you have to remit the amount that the slave did, and on and on and on about all the different rules and reparations they made. And maybe it's, in the same way as that code, moral code, not moral really, so much as legal code, is important in the early Hebrew nation, so also here, that maybe it's not so important what exactly the rules are, but that there are rules that are laid down and there are punishments meted out, so that it removes it from the old way of justice, which is sort of a blood feud. If you offend me, then I'm going to strike you. And then if I strike you, you're going to strike me back, and on and on and on. McCoy Hatfield type of resolution of differences. And what was it? The tragedy, the Orestes cycle, I believe, which describes the advent of legal way of resolving differences rather than this unaccountable fighting back and so forth. So in the same way, it's probably not as important to look at the details of any particular rule that's laid down or punishment that's laid down, but simply the fact that that it is codified is, I think, significant. That's all. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And that comparison is really interesting. The Leviticus comparison and what you said about laws kind of preventing, I guess, maybe some sort of tribal response to misdeeds, I guess. And, maybe that does recall a little bit, that short little quote that I read from what Michael covered right at the end of our last meeting from 874D to 875D of Book 9, that part where it says that the first difficulty is to realize that the proper object of true political skill is not the interest of private individuals, but the common good. This is what knits a state together, whereas private interests make it disintegrate. If the public interest is well served rather than the private, then the individual and the community alike are benefited. So maybe there's something in that. And to build a state, we have to maintain maybe that kind of harmony, which is a big theme in the laws. I guess Book 11 may be giving us a chance to review, in a sense, everything that's happened so far in the laws. And the first 3 or 4 books of the laws really focus quite heavily on harmony and maintaining harmony in the community. And one of the questions I have about what the Athenian is saying here is that these punishments really don't seem to be creating harmony. For example, what he says about slaves, what he says about women, these are all sources of potential disharmony in the community. And so, again, as Clinias rising to that and understanding that there is some conflict here that needs to be resolved. So thank you for pointing those out. And we'll go to Darren.
So these contradictions you've identified, or these tensions that you brought up, I think they're interesting. I guess I wasn't so surprised at them because I feel like discussion about slaves have sort of been throughout the law so far. And also regarding women, I think that the section you read from the earlier section was applied to, I think, a fighting force in military. So maybe they have a kind of equality there. But I think all the guardians were male too. So we learned as much earlier in the dialogue. So there are kinds of like tensions and throughout in these areas. I'm gonna take a stab at trying to like reconcile these ideas though in my own way. I think what you're saying might be a kind of test for Clinias or maybe for us, the reader. I think that's an interesting way to look at it. I haven't thought of that before. I think maybe in part because I don't feel like there's much drama in this dialogue. So I haven't really bothered to look into all these subtleties of what might be going on in the interaction, like in the other Plato dialogues. But okay, so I'll start with the women. So regarding how there seems to be different attitudes towards them. So as I said, like the earlier part was about the military, and here in this book, book 11, the section you brought up was I think related to, there's a huge section in the middle of this book about what happens after you die and your will and all the regulations about wills. It goes on forever. It's really tedious. And so I wonder if all these rules are so important for the Athenian for whatever reason, because there's a section where they were like, we have to stick to this like number 5,040, which has come up before. So we can't just have people starting new families because then, they can't have their own plot of land. If they did, it would be 5,041, which would ruin everything. So there has to be rules about how these things, where people go in a way that doesn't like generate conflict. I have another idea that might interest you though, which is that another big theme of book 11, we haven't touched upon this yet, although I think, we'll probably get there, but it's about trading and the economy and exchange and markets. So I think maybe one of the underlying motivations and concerns here regarding all these rules about succession and like where women go after like the man dies or whatever, all these different various circumstances, is a concern to maintain the justice of the state over time. Because I mean, a big concern in political philosophy is this idea of intergenerational justice, right? How the wealth can become concentrated over generations and time, and this itself could be an inequality, but itself can generate even more inequalities as people with more power, more money, use it to their own advantage. So it just gets worse and worse. And so all these really strict rules about like what happens after you die and what can and cannot go in your will might be like this underlying fear of, as we've also seen elsewhere in the law so far, about preserving the stability of the state in its state over time and maintaining this harmony over time. And how they said in book 11, right, like about how you're not allowed to write whatever you want in your wills.
Yeah.
Because he says ultimately like everything in a way belongs to the state. There was this argument. Yeah, so maybe that's what's motivating it.
And
I'll
I have a
just
short reading on that particular part about wills. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I've gone a long time, so I'll just make one or two sentences about the other part, which is about the slaves. I think throughout the laws, we've seen different approaches to people. Like I think Michael touched upon this last week. There's people who are closer to reason and others who are far away. So maybe like another one of these underlying themes in the law so far is we're creating the second best state, not the best. So maybe a lot of these tensions are just due to this concession to the fact that we're making a second best state. And in fact, the sense we get is that it's not possible to create the most ideal state. You might imagine it, you might dream it, but it's not possible. So anyway, I'll just throw that out there as another possible way to approach these tensions.
Yeah, that's a good point. And appreciate that because both here and in the Statesman, they do talk about the second best state. The ideal, we can hold up the ideal, but we can't ever really achieve the ideal. So we have to go for second best. And I guess it's a question of what compromises we make along the way. And you do rightly call attention to the big question in this book, which is about the distribution of wealth in the colony. Because as I said in my introduction, I think that's probably one of the biggest sources of tension really in many societies is the distribution of wealth. And here we have a society that's limited to 5,040 people. And so significant differences in the distribution are going to cause some pretty dire tensions, I would think. So I think maybe that's why the Athenian maybe has chosen the question of the distribution of wealth to exercise this particular challenge over Clinias. I think he's using one of the most contentious things to exercise the challenge. But we have to recall too, the Athenian is the one who said that all laws should be preceded by a lengthy reasoned preamble, right? Because this reason is at the core of the universe. So we need to provide reasons for the law as well. This part about women, for example, when he says men are, of course, brackets, the superiors of women. So there's no reason provided there. He just says, of course, right? And so it's almost this appeal to, he says, well, let's not even question that because it's our tradition. And so certain things are beyond question. Well, there's no reason applied there, right? So I think whereas in the earlier part that I read about women, he provides a very compelling reason. He says that the state is only going to be half a state if it excludes women. So I think this is a clue, that little bracket, of course, are the superiors of women and children. A bracket, of course, he's trying to tell us, I've made an assumption here. You need to challenge me. So thanks. And we'll go to Phil and then Michael. Phil.
Yeah, this sounds a bit harsh to me, to my modern ears, because there's no concept of rehabilitation. There's just a concept of crime and punishment, and that's it. So it seems like maybe it's driven by the fact that, I think Plato wrote this probably after the rebellion of the 30s that completely destroyed Athens. Maybe that was a thing, that in order to have a state, to retain the state, you have to establish the ultimate sovereignty of the state is above all. And the state has to be able to exercise power in order to punish the crime that is, so there's no challenge to the authority of the state itself. That seems like sort of semi-modern, I suppose, sovereignty, because sovereignty has not been given so much to the general citizens, but the state is the ultimate authority, and is the ultimate authority that can exercise violence in order to punish the wrongdoers by whatever the state thinks is considered wrongdoing. That sounds like a kingdom, a king, or whatever, or an aristocracy that punishes the wrongdoers. Not it kind of leaves out the fact that maybe the aristocracy or the king might do the wrong thing. I mean, how does that work? So I think this is probably a reaction that, in a sense, in order to survive from a state of chaos, the state has to have the power to exercise the authority that's necessary. Now, I'm not going to try to explain the thing that contradicted before, how women are no longer equal. I guess the authority, I guess men sort of have more power and exercise authority or something. I'm not sure about that. But I think this has to do with the fact that without the state, then there is just the free reign of nature, and maybe that's the difference between civilization and non-civilization or barbarians. I don't know. So it seems harsh, but nonetheless, I think that must be the thinking, that the state must survive.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, that certainly does underlie, I think, a lot of this dialogue, the fact that what's good for the state is good for the population. So there's this symbiotic relationship between, goodness for the individual and goodness for the state. But I think here the Athenian is being deliberately contradictory, and I don't think that he's fully serious about these prescriptions that he's making in the laws, because he doesn't present reasons for them. He has gone on at length about the necessity in earlier books about the necessity of providing reasons for the laws, and here he's just throwing all sorts of provisions in here. The types of punishments, the length of the punishment, things like this. None of it's supported by any reason. It's just he's throwing it out, and Clinias is not challenging it, and Megillus is saying nothing. So it's an interesting thing. I really do think it's a test of Clinias. I don't think that the Athenian is being quite serious here. And I don't think this is necessarily what Plato thinks should be the laws. I think this is a test of Clinias, who is going to have to lead the colony, and is Clinias rising to the occasion? So thanks for pointing out that focus on the survival of the community. And I think it's important for the survival of the community that reason be exercised in the laws. So, Michael.
I want to start by saying how much I've enjoyed everyone's comments so far. And James, I'm very much enjoying your very dialectical take to Book 11. So thank you, everyone. I have a longer comment I'll probably make later in our conversation about the state of slavery at this time and in Plato's writings. But I wanted to start off by just adding an observation here that I think is helpful for figuring out what to do with Book 11. I want to say what Book 11 is about. And I think all the characterizations James has given are good ones, but I want to add to that Book 11 is kind of special in that it's where the focus of Clinias, Megillus, and the Athenian turn to what we today would call economics, practical economics, because most of the laws is about these more idealistic things like who should rule and how do you create unity for a society? What's the good religion? What are good cultural, social practices to build camaraderie and so forth? And here we're turning to the kinds of things that tend to energize policy wonks, people who really enjoy the nitty-gritty of legislation. And I think that's significant because I would agree with James that what we really see here, I think, is the Athenian struggling a bit. Maybe it's a challenge to Clinias too. I think that's an interesting take. But I think the primary thing I see here is Economics is difficult, and it's difficult in part because of a concession that the Athenian has made at the outset. Namely, we're not actually building a society from a blank slate, maybe the way we are imagining one in the Republic. Here, we're starting with a community of Cretans who have a past, who have cultural traditions and prejudices and things built in. And that's why a lot of the laws are acknowledged to be second best, third best. We're approximating the ideal. We're not actually achieving it because of the limitations of the clay that we're molding here. And I really think those limitations come through in this chapter in really interesting ways, where we see, I think, the Athenian taking on board, as James said, in an unquestioned manner, the prejudices and assumptions of the community that's going to be founding Magnesia. And so like I said, I'll say more about the slaves later, but for example, with the issue of how wills are bequeathed through an inheritance, the patriarchal character of that, I'm almost certain, is a byproduct of the Cretan cultural practices of that time. And so what we're getting here is a kind of, well, it's an attempt to sort of create a balance between what the ideal is supposed to be and the reality of who these people are. And I just want to make one last kind of closing comment to illustrate that. The section about the wills I actually think is really interesting. And even the section you read, James, which is I think your second pull quote under the status of women, that whole section is discussing what happens to women who are no longer part of a household, because at this time period, households are the basic social unit. And so if you've lost all of your male relatives, your spouse, your father, your brother, something like that, then at the time, women would be in a state of real vulnerability. And I really do think some of what the Athenian is attempting to do is to create a set of laws of mandate for how to secure the future of vulnerable women, given the kind of patriarchal realities that these Cretans are going to bring. And to just illustrate that, I want to read something. James, I don't know if this is further in the handout, so I apologize if this is a slight jump ahead, but this is a section at 925E. And I agree with James that most of Book 11 doesn't give us very many in the way of preambles, but there is a preamble that comes here. There is one reason to count here. And in this section, he talks about the requirement of men following a certain prescription to form a household, marry a woman who has been left destitute and vulnerable. And he just makes a really interesting comment here. He says, "Let us not forget the severity of such laws. It can sometimes be hard for a near relative of the deceased to be instructed to marry his kinswoman by a law that to all appearances takes no account of the thousands of social difficulties that deter people from obeying such instructions in a willing spirit, so that they invariably prefer to put up with anything rather than comply. I mean, difficulties like physical or mental illnesses or defects in the man or woman one is told to marry. I dare say some people imagine the lawgiver is not bothered about these things at all, but they're wrong." And then he goes on to talk about the preamble that they're going to develop in that regard. But that section, what's really being pressed there is the importance of putting the common good, and it talks about on the next page at 926A, says people are going to want to disobey the legislator's orders because they ignore his concern for the common good. And because of his concern for the common good, he won't take as a priority the personal inconvenience experienced by individuals. So a lot of what's going on in this section is this problem of people are going to need to do things for the sake of the common good that they won't want to do. And we're creating a kind of strict, rigid legal framework, I think, to primarily not create a system of punishments, but to create a system of deterrence to get people to realize, hey, the legislator is serious about your need to do something even if you don't want to. As an example, marrying somebody that you think is ugly or that has a mental illness or something like that. Well, that's a personal inconvenience to you, but for the common good, it gives this person status in a household. So that's just one way I think of at least figuring out what are these tensions the Athenians presenting and why they're so difficult, because economic problems are really hard to solve. And I think the Athenian is sort of embodying that difficulty. Thanks.
Thank you. And yeah, definitely the economic problems, as we see now, are very consuming. And you pointed out very interestingly about the provisions made for the support of women. There's also provisions in this book made for the support of orphans. And I think that's important too, because they are incapable of fending for themselves. And so there is that kind of justice, I think, that he's trying to bring into that question too. So yeah, and I think it was interesting the way you said that, it's kind of forcing people to do things that they might not otherwise want to do for the common good. And I think that's very important. The virtue being the keystone of this community, and understanding that no one is able to live all entirely on their own capabilities. We all need somebody for some function, for some aspect of living. And so the fact that they'll need each other at some point in their lives is important to make sure that they do consider the common good. So yeah, I very much I like that. I do think though that the Athenian is being, I would say, tongue in cheek almost. And I see Darren and Phil next, but let me just read another section here, one of these contrasts, and this talks about doing good for the community. So what I put for the reason to count was from book 10, this short but very beautiful section, 903C to D, where the Athenian in book 10 said, "You forget that creation is not for your benefit. You exist for the sake of the universe. Every doctor you see and every skilled craftsman always works for the same of some end product as a whole. He handles his materials so that they will give the best results in general and makes the parts contribute to the good of the whole, not vice versa. But you're grumbling because you don't appreciate your position is best not only for the universe, but for you too, thanks to your common origin. And since a soul is allied with different bodies at different times and perpetually undergoes all sorts of changes, either self-imposed or produced by some other soul, the divine checkers player has nothing else to do except promote a soul with a promising character to a better situation and relegate one that is deteriorating to an inferior, as is appropriate in each case, so that they all meet the fate that they deserve." So that was that part. Then, and I pulled this, what I think is a contrast in book 11 from 913C to D, in which they're talking about, particular rule about property. So it starts off, the Athenian says, "Hands off immovables is aptly applied to a great many situations, and this is one of them. And we should put our trust in the traditional view of such conduct, that it injures our descendants. Suppose a man takes no thought for his children and becomes indifferent to the legislator and removes what neither he himself nor his father nor any of his fathers before him deposited without the consent of the depositor. Suppose he thus undermines the finest law there is, that simple rule of thumb, formulated as it was by a man of great nobility," and here he's referring to Solon, "don't pick up what you didn't put down. Well, when a man treats these two legislators," and referring to Solon and Magnesia's legislator, "so contemptuously and picks up something he had not put down, what penalty should he suffer?" I'll talk about that penalty shortly, but what's interesting here is particularly what he says, we should put our trust in the traditional view of such conduct. Well, that's not applying reason, I don't think. And then he says, the finest law there is, that simple rule of thumb. Again, I think he's trying to signal to us that he's not applying reason. Who operates by rules of thumb? Who operates by traditional views? This is not the kind of colony that he's advocated for. And again, does Clinias ever respond to this? Does Clinias call him out and say, wait, you said before that we should have lengthy reason preambles to the laws. And here you're saying, we'll just go by the simple rule of thumb or the traditional view. There's something up in this book. Like the Athenian is not being the normal Athenian. This Athenian in book 11 is not the Athenian that was here in book 10. So I just wanted to point that out. And again, we can talk about this. I have a few more contrasts here to pick up. So I'll start with Darren and then Phil and then Fred. Darren.
So I think you're definitely tapping into like real tensions in this book, in the laws in general, actually. And I've been noticing them in previous books too. So I'm glad we're sort of thematizing it this time. I like what Michael said about it, though, which is that we're not starting from a blank slate. So we're taking actual people who already have a tradition, and we're forming a state based on these people who already come from a society and a culture, and so already have certain ideas and a certain culture and a language and a sense of community. I remember this, this brings back all that discussion in, I think, book 2, or I don't know, it was no, sorry, book 4 or 5, about who the people should be and where these people should come from. And there they were saying that it's better if they have a common language or already share a common way of life. It'll make it easier, and and all that. The thing that isn't being discussed by the Athenian, and would help, I think, you, James, and us, if it was discussed, is, so accepting, Michael's view that, yeah, we're not starting from a blank slate. But I think the confusing thing is that the book contains all kinds of things that are supposed to be new and radically new in some cases. Okay, so we're drawing from a pre-existing culture and people with traditions and prejudices, but the Athenian still wants to create, we still want to create a new state with new kinds of laws. And this motivated some earlier discussion, I think, I don't know, it was book 6 or whatever, about how we're going to get people to accept these laws that they've never heard of before and they're just radically new. And I think like communal dining was also one of the things. So sure, like I agree with Michael that some of these aspects that's like perplexing to us is based on the fact that we're drawing from pre-existing people, but there's also a lot of changes. So like, where's the line? Like, where do we decide to, okay, we're going to change this, and then but here we're going to fall back on people's prejudices and we're just going to leave it there? Like, that's very confusing, and I think that's leading to, I think, James' rightful confusions. And like, I've had this question as I've been reading this too, and so I just want to bring like a similar kind of thing that's been confusing me. I think it falls like into the scope of this problem too. Yeah, so James was pointing out all the stuff about men and women and how like it seemed to be saying here that men are, are superior in book 11. I've personally noticed that in many of these books so far, that although in book 10, which is, the book about religion and theology and about God, and how it seems like he ultimately has this very abstract view of God as basically reason, which is the source of the universe, like logos. But in so many of the preambles and the discussions, the Athenian constantly appeals to various superstitions about what gods do. Like, there's a section in this book today about why we should honor our parents. And that's because, if our parents ever curse us, the gods will always take their side. And he talks about all these stories that in the past about where this has happened. I think there's a story about Oedipus and, the whole bunch of stories. And, so we definitely know that the gods will take the side of the parents over the children, so, which is why you should honor your parents. And then there was in a section about orphans, and it wasn't appeal to reason. It was like, oh, if you're mean to an orphan, the gods will be mad. There was some discussion about this. And, this happens a lot in the law. So those are just two like little examples, but like, it seems to contradict, though, that in a way that you've identified about other things, James, with the discussion of this very abstract God in book 10 and in other dialogues of Plato's, frankly, that Plato doesn't actually seem to believe in all these particular gods, but he seems to think that other people can believe them and maybe they won't stop believing them. So like in an earlier book, he actually explicitly talked about a truly religious view, which is like very, very idealistic, and then a secular approach to ethics, which is like all about pain and pleasure. I mean, I remember we had a discussion about this. So again, like the discussion of God bifurcates in this way too. There's this very abstract ideal God, which is just one God, and it's very abstract about reason. But when he's trying to justify these things about, honoring your parents and treating or how we treat orphans, he appeals to these superstitious ideas and traditional beliefs in a way like how he also appealed to, prejudices about men and women and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I'm just saying, like, this is like a thing throughout, and it might be like a test for Clinias, but it might also be an acknowledgement again of what I said earlier. Like there's maybe a religious view for who understand higher philosophical things, and then there's a more sort of secular, down to earth view which is all based on pain and pleasure, and you don't want to get punished by the gods because that would be pain, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's just another perspective on it.
And that's helpful. I think that really, too, we have to be mindful of the dramatic turn, I think, in Book 11 from Book 10. Like this is, as I said, a very different Athenian. So I don't know whether he's being serious or not. I guess we can't be certain whether he's being serious about these laws. But I do find it interesting to see the lack of reaction from Clinias, because the Athenian has said in a previous book that he's not going to be part of the government of this new community. Clinias did ask him at one point if he would join, and he said, no, I'm going back home. So he is kind of like that sailor in book 4 that blows into town, uproots the community, and then leaves. And then so the Athenian doesn't have to face the consequences. The interesting thing, though, I think, is what Clinias is going to do. So the Athenian leaves. Clinias is left there writing the laws. Has Clinias expressed even once any sort of opinion about whether any of these proposals are correct? Like 33 laws. The Athenian hits us with 33 laws in this book, which is actually, I think, probably his record. And does Clinias say anything about them? And does Clinias call out the lack of reasoning in them? And I think that's the interesting thing. I think just like there were fundamental flaws in Atlantis and fundamental flaws in Callipolis in the Republic, I'm seeing some fundamental faults in this community. And I think maybe Plato is trying to tell us that virtue can't be taught. I think that's maybe the conclusion of the Meno. And here they're trying to build a community on virtue. And he's not trying to teach virtue. I think he's trying to tease out the reasons why Clinias might think that certain actions are virtuous or not. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind is let's focus on Clinias. He's the one who's going to have to deal with this. So thanks. And we'll go to Phil.
Yeah, I really like what Michael said, because the contrast between the Republic, which is an ideal, and this is a real situation. It really reminded me of the relationship between Hegel and Marx, because I think human beings have to exist not only in this sort of like this sort of spirit, but it also have to exist in an existential world of things and survival in that sense. So to the degree that in some sense the laws and the republics almost anticipated Hegel's argument with Marx about Marx's argument with Hegel, it seems like between dialectical idealism that evolves into an ideal state of spirit and dialectical materialism, which actually moves it in relationship to survival with the economy and between the mind and the body. I mean, I think that dialectic is kind of an important structure. Now, I sort of like Marx in a limited way. I certainly do not like Marxist-Leninism that turned into Stalinism. But nonetheless, I think this idea of taking care of the people who are suffering in a bodily way, I think that's an important part. And I think bringing that part in is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how you're going to bring it in such a way that it relates, because I think most people are going to be living in the body. Only the philosopher is living in the mind, And so I think creating that contrast, I think, is important between dialectical idealism and dialectical materialism, because I think that's what we all exist in. Unless you're really, really deep into philosophy, you could just live a very, very impoverished life, Diogenes or something, and you're not going to do very well in terms of surviving. So I think the consciousness to that it's kind of an important part. That's it, Phil.
Yeah, thanks for calling attention to that difference between theory and practice, which really reminds me of The Statesman, which I had a chance to review before preparing for today's meeting. And the statesman starts off with that very question, there's theory, but then there's a practice. And certainly economic theories, I think as we know now, and practices can be very different. And so this is maybe why this particular subject was chosen for Book 11, because it involves maybe a subject, the distribution of wealth, where the theory and the practice can diverge perhaps most significantly and create the most division. So I think that's an important distinction between theory and practice. And so I guess here the Athenian is trying to bring into practice a number of very specific points, but maybe forgetting theoretical side of it, which really is to tie it to the reasons. So yeah, very good observation. Thank you. And Fred.
Book 11 is highly pragmatic in contrast to prior books. And I think that's intentional. And it points out the limits of using reason to codify your laws, because you'll never get complete coverage of all the possible actions of human beings. And that's a fine example that he brings up here of what we now call common law or case law, which derives from the English. You have this really quite good, quite nice saying that you should never pick up what you didn't put down, which is a fine heuristic that you can live by. Although it's hard to make that into a law per se and provide rational justification for it. But there will always be cases that fall between the cracks of the written law, and judges have to find a way to adjudicate that. And one of the ways they do that is to fall back on common law. So as an example, there is a common law notion of offenses against public decency, public obscenity, that you can fall back on. So you might have written laws about this and that form of pornography or whatever, but inevitably you're going to have cases that fall between the cracks. For example, taking a picture of somebody on an iPhone in a compromising position without their consent. Okay, the law doesn't consider that, or didn't before, because it didn't have there was not a body of law dealing with iPhones, at least not until recently. And so there are case laws saying, well, you can't do that. But now we've gone one step further, where we have codified laws that hopefully are based in some sort of rational argument for that. But now we are in the situation where you have AI generated photos or videos of people in compromising settings that are done against their will. Well, we have very little so far. We have a paucity of laws that deal with that. So now you again have to fall back on common law. A judge has to fall back on common law to deal with that. They would hope that there were or could be or will be laws that deal with a particular situation, but judges are not in the business of providing de novo rational justifications for their rulings. So they will rely on the text of the law or on precedent. Common law is essentially a precedent based on conventions of society. So there, the intent is actually that they do not provide a basis in reason for their ruling. They always look for precedent if it's not in the text of the law. And so this is, to me, and it's an example of many in this book of what we would call common law. Thanks.
That's an interesting observation. Very interesting because, yeah, as you point out, I mean, technology is moving so quickly that the lawmakers now just simply haven't been able to keep up. And so, in Canada, for example, we're still trying to apply the Broadcast Act, which was written in the 1970s, to a world where most broadcasts are now over the internet, and the act just simply doesn't apply. But they haven't been able to move as quickly with this. So, yeah, as you say, the common law is an important thing, but I think reason is still required in the common law in terms of connecting the precedent to the situation at hand. And so reason, I think, is still necessary there, but it's a good point to bring up. And it's actually very helpful because we'll see in our next meeting on Book 12, which is the last book of the laws, where the Athenian moves from this very prescriptive sense of justice that or very prescriptive laws that he's applying here in Book 11. He moves away from that in Book 12. In Book 12, he starts saying things like, well, the punishment should be suitable to the crime committed. more general instead of very specific, like he's doing here in Book 11. So I think maybe there is some of that, as you say, that move towards some understanding that not all situations can be predicted in advance and prescribed for in advance. So it's an important point. And I think, as I said, we'll see that in Book 12. So thanks for raising that. And we'll go to Ella.
Thank you, James. Great discussion, everyone. Yeah, I appreciate all the insights, but I'm going to go back to Phil's comment I thought was particularly insightful, along with all the others. About this change, indeed, one would run into a lot of human resistance, and, it would be difficult to sort out what is fair, what is just for the society and for the individual. It's a complex endeavor involving, the subjective human beings as individuals and the need to work within the society as a whole. So I appreciate the Hegel-Marx dialectical insights and the differences therein. And I wanted to bring up a third example, John Rawls as a libertarian. So he would be sort of, in the middle, trying to make things work, as it were, peacefully, trying to promote, especially in his original principles of justice. I understand it was modified to justice as fairness later on, and a lot of the economic insistence on egalitarianism economically was possibly compromised. But his original theory of justice was about extreme economic equality. And of course, as you know, using the veil of ignorance as a thought experiment to actually induce all of us to understand that we could end up in any household, any type of family situation, and being dependent in any culture anywhere in the world. We want to make everything fair for everyone economically all over the world. I won't deal with the other aspect. He has another principle that deals with protecting vulnerable groups of people, which is very important as well. But I think that has been addressed by Darren and others. So I'm just concentrating on the economic aspect for now. So through the difference principle, John Rawls, with the difference principle, in his original theory of justice, talks about all of these great changes, gives great arguments for why it's best for each individual in society to be able to achieve what they're capable of achieving. Think of Maslow's hierarchy. They can become who they're capable and who they want to be because they have the economic resources and the education to do so. And of course, that would be best for the society. But when one tries to implement something like this through peaceful means, how would one go about it? Well, do you change the tax laws? Do you write an amendment as such that there would be X amount of equality economically? Do you do a number of different changes to bring about a very real and significant change that is perhaps not exactly equal and never will be, but very close to being equal by economic standards? And so, I guess the idea that it's clearly you're going to meet that resistance is just built in. You give a child 2 ice cream cones and another none, you're going to get distress. And if you try to take one away, you're going to get distress. So I think keeping in mind that we're going to have resistance, we're going to have distress, and it's legitimate to a certain extent, but we have to have a fair and just way of looking at it for the individuals and the society that one could move ahead. But it's not easy.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, definitely the devil is in the details, right? And you said an interesting word, fair. And I think, I asked in the introduction what we would do if we were able to write the laws for Magnesia. And, maybe fairness is really one of the core bases of the laws. It has to be fair. And we see problems, of course, when theorists like Marx would want to redistribute wealth. And that obviously led to all sorts of problems because what he thought in theory was very hard to put into practice, and things change over time. And so I think that's where maybe these first principles and what the Athenian was trying to reason in the earlier books is to really understand what the first principles of these laws are supposed to be. So I think that's an important point. And, as you said, maybe the point of this book too is to talk about the distribution of wealth. And maybe it is to kind of ensure that each person in Magnesia has the ability to reach their potential, as you said. So it was an interesting comment. Let me just go ahead. I want to just read another few of these contrasts. So this is again from book 10, 906b, and I'm going to contrast it to book 11, 917c. So in book 10, 906b, the Athenian says, "What ruins us is injustice and senseless aggression. What protects us is justice and sensible moderation. Virtues that are part of the spiritual characteristics of the gods, although one can find them quite clearly residing among us too, albeit on a small scale. Now, there are some souls living on earth in possession of ill-gotten gains, who in their obviously brutish way throw themselves before the souls of their guardians, whether watchdogs, shepherds, or masters of the utmost grandeur, and by wheedling words and winning entreaties try to persuade them of the truth of the line put about by scoundrels, that they have the right to feather their nest with impunity at mankind's expense. But I suppose our view is that this vice we've named, acquisitiveness, is what is called disease when it appears in flesh and blood, and plague when brought by the seasons or at intervals of years. Well, if it occurs in the state and society, the same vice turns up under yet another name, injustice." So that was kind of maybe the theoretical approach to it. And then he goes in book 11 to actually put it into practice. But again, there's some words I think that we need to be thinking about in what he says in book 11 from 917c to 917e. He says, "The seller of any article in the market must never name two prices for his goods, but only one. And if he doesn't get it, he will, bracket quite rightly, close bracket, remove his wares without raising or lowering his price that day. And he must not push anything he has for sale or take an oath on its quality." Then he gets into law number 67 here. Law number 67. If a man disobeys these regulations, any citizen, italicized, highlighted, any citizen passing by, provided he is not less than 30 years of age, no reason applied for that, but he is not less than 30 years of age for some reason, should punish the taker of the oath and beat him with impunity. And then he goes on, law 68. If the passerby ignores these instructions and disobeys them, he must be liable to the reproach of having betrayed the laws. Continues, if a man proves to be beyond persuasion by our present address and sells a faulty article, the passerby who has the knowledge and ability to expose him should prove his case before the authorities. And if a slave or resident alien may then take the faulty article for himself, a citizen, however, should dedicate it to the gods of the marketplace. Law number 69. If a citizen fails to expose the offender, he should be pronounced a rogue, as he has cheated the gods. And law number 70. Anyone discovered selling such adulterated merchandise, apart from being deprived of it, must be whipped, one lash for every drachma of the asking price of the object he was selling, after a herald has announced in the marketplace the reason why the culprit is going to be flogged. So yeah, I think the reason that some of these words have been highlighted by Plato is to draw attention to the kind of randomness, arbitrariness of what he's saying. Any citizen passing by, provided he is not less than 30 years of age, should punish the taker of the oath and beat him with impunity. Like, this is brutality. Like, this could be brutality. Now, do we think Plato would condone brutality? Do we think the Athenian would condone brutality? I think by highlighting the fact that any citizen passing by could do this, he's trying to say to us, well, okay, here we've created a society with guardians of laws and procedures to make sure that justice is properly meted out. And yet we're allowing now somebody who just happens to be walking by to deliver a potentially violently brutal punishment. And no court warrant is required. No judges are required. It's just you see something, you don't like it, you beat the person. Is the Athenian being serious here? I don't see it. I think this is such a radical turn from what the Athenian has said before. Again, I think that he's trying to get some sort of a reaction from Clinias, and he's not getting a reaction from Clinias. So we'll go to Phil and then Darren.
What came to mind for me is the two cases of moderation. Not quite to the level of beating somebody just because you're walking by that misbehaving. Because if you could teach the people to behave moderately from the beginning, then you would not have this kind of trouble because it's about their proper behavior within reason. And moderation taken the other way is that now it's thrown back to not the guy who offends, but the guy who, in a sense, see the offending. You should be moderate in your beating, if there is a beating. In other words, there's a difference between moderation, which stresses don't even misbehave to begin with. I mean, within a certain limitations, and what I would call moderation in terms of tolerance, that you see misbehavior, you have to become now tolerant of the other within the thing. That's already a state of fallenness because you are in your moderation in a funny way, almost encouraging the misbehavior because you have to like hold it in and not give the guy a brutal beating, which is proper, but it's already fallen to the state that has to be responded in moderation rather than being moderate in terms of your actions to begin with. So that's interesting, because I certainly believe in tolerance, but then you have to kind of almost hold it in and suffer to a certain degree because almost like, that's not that big of a deal. I'm going to let it go, unless it's really a big deal, then you're not going to let it go. So it's an interesting sort of procedure. Where does the moderation should be? So that's interesting. That's my thought about that.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like the word moderation because that requires, I think, the application of reason. And here, I don't think there's any reason being applied here. It's just a beating is required, and a beating to any extent. There's no reasoning here. And what's missing here too is forgiveness. I mean, maybe the seller of the article maybe didn't know about the law, or maybe was under some sort of pressure that was driving him to do something that he would later regret. And so maybe given a chance to reform himself, he would have. But no, we don't give him any chance to do that. We just beat him.
Well, tolerance is a kind of forgiveness in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's when you said tolerance, it made me think of forgiveness. And that I think is to maintain harmony in the community, which is a key of the early books of the laws. One would have to allow for the fact that, no human is perfect. So I'm not sure that I'm seeing a harmonious community here when we have citizens or passersby beating whoever they think is being not virtuous. It's an interesting dilemma. But again, I think the Athenian is trying to get us to rise to the occasion and say, well, okay, let's go back and let's restore the primacy of reason and really think these through. Let's not just go with what our gut is telling us, I think is what he's trying to say here. Darren, your thoughts?
So, okay, I'm trying to put together an idea about this to respond to your concern. I'll just first observe that. So this is another thing I've been noticing throughout the laws, and there hasn't been really an opportunity to discuss this yet. So it's good that there's a chance now, which is that for so many of the laws, not just in book 11, just throughout this book or the dialogue of the laws, there is a lot of what I would call community policing. Like people have to report each other all the time. And not only that, but there are punishments for not reporting things that are often as severe or nearly as severe as the actual crime itself that you have to report. So this is throughout the laws. So the only difference here, though, regarding what you were just talking about regarding, any passersby can like beat them or whatever, which actually is one of the milder punishments in the laws, okay, frankly, considering like all the stuff about flogging and that the death penalty for all kinds of things and exile, like this actually seems a beating seems actually kind of nice. But the only difference really is that it's just any old passerby can do it. So it's not about reporting it. And people have to do a lot of reporting in this society, but there's like an immediate punishment that's kind of doled out. And I sort of see this happening in the market, right? Because actually, as we read in book 11, like these exchanges can only take place in the market. So it will be someone in this, I'm assuming like marketplace, where there's a lot of people doing exchanges, and then you notice a cheater, and then you're given permission by the law to beat them because they're trying to cheat with the price or something. So you're saying like there isn't reason in this. So I'm just saying that this is a thought I'm just having. I think there might be more reason in it than you think, James. It's just up to us to maybe extract the logic behind this. Because I actually, when I read it, it didn't actually strike me as so like crazy. And I think one part of why we're not just reporting the crime here, but you're allowed to immediately like beat them and like tell other people, oh, this guy's a cheater, this is the marketplace, is because it is a marketplace. And it also has something to do with, I think, a problem of time and timing. And there's hints that in these marketplaces that it's not just like the local citizens, right? There's a sense that there are outsiders who are coming to trade too. I say this because there was a stipulation, a very interesting one, that after a transaction is made, the person has to stick around for like 5 days or whatever. Like you can't just leave the city right away. You have to like stick around because there might be issues with how much you make the person pay or the quality of the product. There might be problems with that. It might be adulterated, the word that's used, at least in translation. But I think that's a hint for what the Athenian might be tapping into or sensing about the problem of the marketplace. There's this problem of time. So like reporting, I'm assuming, okay, reporting is nice for all the other things, but here, if there are traders coming in and out of this market and they might leave, you sort of want to identify the cheater here or the person selling shoddy products or fake products immediately, you know, because it's a market. There's a kind of speed to it. And actually, I hope we get more into this, but there's a lot of really interesting discussion of markets here. I was actually thinking of this book 11 is like Plato's business ethics in a way. So when I read this, there's actually a lot of interesting material for thinking about what markets are for. There's explicit statements about the purpose of markets and how we're supposed to conduct ourselves in markets. But although this aspect of the time and the speed of markets is not explicit, I think it comes through in some of the regulations I already mentioned about how you have to stick around. And so this beating by the passerby thing just might be how the Athenian, or maybe just by extension Plato, is imagining a marketplace and how, you know, there's a sort of rapid fire thing going on here. There's also another thing about time. For instance, I've just highlighted this, how the transfer must be made by handing over the article in the appointed part of the marketplace and nowhere else, and by receiving the price on the nail. No payment for delivery later or sales on credit is to be allowed. So this, again, a concern with time. You can't deliver it later. You have to pay the exact price that's been declared. No sale on credit. There's a kind of interest in time in the background, which I think provides, maybe it wasn't made explicit, but I think does provide some logic to why, you know, the beatings, the passerby beatings that, you know, you're suggesting that maybe aren't. And I agree, it's not explicit, like this logic, but I feel like just from reading this section, I just felt like there was a deeper logic about how markets are being imagined here, and thus how they should be regulated. But hopefully we'll get into more about the regulations later, but I'll just stop there.
Yeah, no, thanks. And yeah, we have only, unfortunately, about a half an hour left in the scheduled time. So I do want to get to a reading. I think I won't have a chance to do all of the readings, but I wanted to do the reading on the wills in particular. But you rightly call it very interesting, actually, calling out the idea of time with the market and the fact that things constantly move in the market. We don't necessarily have time to act on anything. Although we hear, you know, this, it's not just a beating, it's a beating with impunity. So that's maybe going a little bit overboard in the timing urgency, perhaps, if there is an urgency on that. There is certainly a very interesting theory of money here, that, you know, value accrues in the community, and value can't all go to one person or a small group of people. The value needs to continue circulating. Money needs to continue circulating for there to be growth and harmony in the community. And that's one of the interesting ideas that's underlying this book. As disturbing as some of the things in this book might be, it's a very interesting theme that's in this book. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So maybe we'll get to that part on the wills in particular, in terms of just, you know, what it's saying about money itself. Fred.
This passage is an outlier, I think, in the marketplace, perhaps for the reasons that Darren raises. They also note that in the second part of that, not only says that the passerby can beat the offender with impunity. He says that if a passerby does not call him to account and beat him with impunity, the passerby will be held accountable for not enforcing it.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, for example, if the passerby is a competitor of the vendor, is that still okay for the competitor to beat the guy with impunity because he happens to think that he offended him in some way? But we will see in the subsequent rulings or rules, for example, on 915C and the one following that, where it will more typically, it'll say such cases should be tried in the tribal courts. And then there's an interesting provision for moderation. Unless the litigants have previously settled arbitration, unless the litigants have previously settled their charges against each other before their neighbors, that is, judges they have chosen themselves. And if an offense happens first, you try to resort to arbitration. Secondly, you bring the case before the tribal courts. A much more sensible and moderate approach that we'll see in subsequent passages. So
Yeah, thanks for raising that. And there is that provision for arbitration. And it is interesting, as I think Darren said, that there are so many roles for people in this community. Like there's 5,040 people in the community. And when you add up all of the different offices in this community and all of the different roles in this community, it's almost as if everybody has a role to fill. And we'll see another role being added in book 12 when we get to that in 2 weeks' time. So yeah, maybe everybody does have a hand in this in some way. But
No, this is quite sensible. This is quite sensible. This is the sensibility of the Chinese Cultural Revolution.
Yeah. And I think that I haven't heard any comments among the participants on Clinias. And so are we taking what the Athenian is saying to be what Plato intends for this community? Are we taking what the Athenian says as to what Clinias should be acting on when he takes over control of the community? I haven't heard any comments on that. Again, we have 33 laws that the Athenian has proposed here, and Clinias hasn't pushed back on a single one of them. Michael, your thoughts?
I'm saving my comments for a fuller reaction to your next little excerpt here, but just a quick response to your question there. I tend to think that Plato's own perspective lurks in the text, but I try to not ever associate Plato as being synonymous with a particular speaker. And I do think in this book that I suspect a lot of what's going on is this is trial and error. Like, some ideas are being tried out here. And I think the struggle is real because these particular topics are not all of them. I think the text is actually really good on the destitute women or orphans or some of the other stuff that comes right at the very end of the book. But I do think there are sections where you can almost hear Plato's wheels turning of, man, how do you work with these people? They're so messed up. So I think it would be a mistake to take this as straightforwardly Plato's voice. I think Plato is sort of wrestling through this in his own mind, and he's trying this out through the Athenian to see what it looks like. But the way book 10 reads and then the way book 12 reads, as we'll see in our next episode, there's such a return to more familiar Platonic territory that I think this is just an uncomfortable realm that, he had thoughts on and was trying to figure things out with, but found these economic problems really challenging.
It's an interesting idea. I think that Plato absolutely knew what he was going in to talk about here. And I think this is about Clinias. I don't think it's about serious laws. I think it's about Clinias and Clinias's behavior in this. And yeah, I don't see Plato as an experimenter. I think he's trying to make a point, but it's an interesting idea. Definitely an interesting idea. Let me just read this one last bit about the contrast, and then I will take Phil's comment, and then I want to read, because again, we're running out of time as always, I want to read that part about the wills at the end, so maybe we can get a little bit of the economic theory in here. So there's a couple of sections. I'll just read a couple from book 6, actually, about slaves. So book 6, 776 D to E, the Athenian says, "We know we'd all agree that a man should own the best and most docile slaves he can get. After all, many a paragon of a slave has done much more for a man than his own brother or son, and they have often been the salvation of their masters' persons and property and entire homes." And then further on, and just shortly after in book 6, again, 776 D to E, he says, "The best way to train slaves is to refrain from arrogantly ill-treating them and to harm them even less, assuming that's possible, than you would your equals. You see, when a man can hurt someone as often as he likes, he'll soon show whether or not his respect for justice is natural and unfeigned and springs from a genuine hatred of injustice. If his attitude to his slaves and his conduct towards them are free of any taint of impiety and injustice, he'll be splendidly effective at sowing the seeds of virtue." And that speaks to that beating with impunity as well. If a man can hurt someone as often as he likes, he'll soon show whether or not his respect for justice is natural or unfeigned. So I wanted to raise those, and then I want to contrast it to book 11, 913D to 914A. When a man picks up something he had not put down, what penalty should he suffer? We asked that question before, so this is where the answer comes in. God knows the penalty of heaven, but the first person to notice such an occurrence in the city should report it to the city wardens. If somewhere in the country, he should inform the country wardens and their chiefs. On receiving the information, he should send to Delphi and, in submission to the oracles of the god, do whatever he ordains about the objects and the person who removed them. If the informant is a free man, he should acquire a reputation for virtue, but law number 63. A, if a free man fails to inform, he must get a reputation for vice. If the informant is a slave, then as a reward, he will deservedly be presented with freedom by the state, which will give his master what he is worth. But B, if a slave fails to inform, he must be punished by death. So here we have a different type of punishment meted out here. He goes on, the natural thing to do next is to apply this same rule to all objects, important or trivial. If a man leaves some piece of his own property somewhere deliberately or inadvertently, anyone who finds it should let it be, on the assumption that such things are under the protection of the goddess of the wayside, to whom they are consecrated by law. Well, where did this consecration come about, right? Law number 64. If in defiance of this rule, someone picks up an object of no great value and takes it home, and A, he is a slave, he should be soundly beaten by any passerby who is not less than 30 years of age. B, if he is a free man, in addition to being thought ungentlemanly and lawless, he must pay the person who left the article 10 times its value. So again, where are the preambles to these rules that are being brought up? Where's the reasons? What goddess of the wayside? All of this. I have a lot of questions about this. So I just wanted to raise that. And then just in the interest of time, and we'll go back to Phil, and then I think, Michael, if you have another point to make, let me just, so I can get it on the table, the reading about, there's one short reading here that I want to do. This is just a little introduction. So this is not, I'm talking not about the contrast here anymore. This is just a short little introduction, I think, to this idea of material wealth. And this is really, I think, an interesting comment here. 913A to B. The Athenian says, the next subject needing to be reduced to due order will be our transactions with each other. So this is kind of right at the beginning of book 11. I suppose something like this will serve as a general rule. Ideally, no one should touch my property or tamper with it unless I have given him some sort of permission. And if I am sensible, I shall treat the property of others with the same respect. Let's take as our first example treasure which someone who was not one of my ancestors stored away for himself and his family. I should never pray to the gods to come across such a thing, and if I do, I must not disturb it, nor tell the diviners, as they are called, who, I shall find, can always invent some reason for advising one to remove something deposited in the ground. The financial benefit I'd get from removing it could never rival what I'd gain by way of virtue and moral rectitude by leaving it alone. By preferring to have justice in my soul rather than money in my pocket, I'd get, treasure for treasure, the better bargain, and for a better part of myself too. I wanted to just read that bit, and then I'll go ahead and just read what I have from the last page. This is the idea of the wills which Darren mentioned earlier, 922C to 923B, and the idea of returning something to the community from which the value accrued. So this is some of the economic theory here. The Athenian says, when a man is about to die, Clinias, he becomes refractory and keeps harping on a principle that spreads alarm and despondency among legislators. How's that? Asks Clinias. In his anxiety for complete authority, he's apt to express himself with some warmth, which I take to mean vigor or heatedly. Clinias says, to what effect? Ye gods, says he, it's a fine thing if I'm not going to be allowed to give or not give my own property to anyone I please. Why should I give more to one man and less to another, depending on whether they have shown themselves good or bad friends to me? My illnesses, my old age, and all my other various misfortunes have sorted them out well enough. Clinias says, well, sir, don't you think that's well said? Athenian says, Clinias, my view is that the ancient lawgivers were too easygoing and legislated on the basis of a superficial and inadequate appreciation of the human condition. How do you mean, says Clinias? My dear fellow, because they feared the line of argument I've mentioned, they passed a law allowing a man to dispose of his own property in his will exactly as he pleases. But when people have come to death's door in your estate, you and I will make a rather more appropriate response. We'll say, friends, you creatures of a day, in more senses than one, it's difficult for you in your present circumstances to know the truth about your own property and also know yourselves, as the Delphic inscription puts it. Therefore, I, as legislator, rule that neither you nor this property of yours belongs to yourselves, but to your whole clan, ancestors, and descendants alike, and your clan and its property in turn belong even more absolutely to the state. That being so, I should be reluctant to tolerate someone worming himself into your good graces when you are smitten with illness or old age, and wheedling you into making a will that is not for the best. I shall legislate with a view to nothing except the interest of your clan and the entire state, relegating, as is only right, that of the individual to second place. So as you go on your journey, which is the way of all flesh, show restraint and goodwill towards us. We will look after your affairs for the future and guard your interests with the utmost care, down to the smallest detail. So I wanted to get that on the table. Again, this idea of doing good for the community, superseding doing good for the individual, and doing good for the community is therefore doing good for the individual, not just that individual in the individual's lifetime, but the individual's descendants as well. And so maybe that's the theory of time, maybe that Darren raised a little bit earlier. So I have Phil, Michael, Darren, and Ella. So we'll start with Phil.
Yeah, I wonder whether Clinias hasn't responded. And to a certain degree, I blame the Athenian, because I think he was speaking in a very sophisticated, ironic language. And Clinias, because he has given such good arguments before, and he's always been, oh, yes, I think you're right. I mean, that's all his response. I think maybe he was just afraid of responding because he had drank so much of the Kool-Aid and the early things that this mistake must be something that's deep and it's true. I'm not going to speak. It reminded me of when Bobby Fischer played Boris Baski in the chess in the first game. He made a big mistake. And I remember all the commentary on the TV of the Grandmaster saying, we think that's a mistake, but that's Bobby. Bobby did that. We must be wrong. So they were afraid to call it. So I think maybe part of that is that, he was speaking ironically and that he didn't understand. So in some sense, I don't know if the test is correct, but because he's speaking almost in a different language. And, Clinias had drank so much of the Kool-Aid, it better not respond because what if he said, I think that's wrong, what you said. I mean, do you dare say that to somebody who said something so sensible before? So, I think that Athenian holds some responsibility for the lack of response.
Yeah, you touched on a really important point there, that this deference to authority, that the Athenian seems to have established himself as some authority. Like, for example, in Book 5, it was only the Athenian speaking in Book 5. Mm. So you're right, the Athenian has established himself as an authority, and certainly with Book 10, which I just love Book 10, the Athenian to me is the authority on that stuff. So yes, how can we challenge him? But this is the problem for legislators, that they may want to defer to some authority which actually may not be very authoritative. I mean, maybe Clinias is lucky that the Athenian is of goodwill, but other people could metaphorically sail into the community and impose their authority with, lofty words. And sophists do this, which I think Plato would have a lot to say about sophists. So, is the Athenian being a sophist? Or maybe the Athenian is acting kind of in a way, play acting as kind of a bit of a sophist, just to see if Clinias can rise to the occasion. And again, Clinias doesn't. He just agrees. He agrees with everything. An interesting idea, though, that deference to authority and maybe just being overwhelmed by authority. But Clinias is going to have to stand up for himself when he's leading the community. So thanks for raising that. And then we'll go to Michael.
I'll try to keep this as brief as I can, James. I just, now that you've read that passage where you draw out the tension with respect to slavery, I wanted to say just a little bit about Plato's relationship to the issue of slavery, because we haven't really hit that directly, I don't think, in these discussions. And, in the Republic, in the Meno, in some of the other dialogues like the Gorgias, and as you noted here in the earlier books of the laws, I do think Plato has, without question, some of the most progressive views on slaves of anyone who was alive at that time. But, anybody looking at this, and as Darren pointed out, you can see that he does not call for the abolition of chattel slavery. And here in book 11, the Athenian is giving prescriptions for, how slaves are going to be incorporated into this system of respecting each other's property. And I think it's worth at least understanding a little bit of the historical context in which this is happening, because Plato is faced with a particularly vexing problem as he writes this book, which is the Cretans are people who already own slaves within their households. And the main source of interaction with slaves are going to come from two sources. One is trade interactions with foreign nations, foreign city-states, and the other is going to be slaves taken in the course of battle. That was actually the primary source of slavery, was your city-state at a war with another city-state, and whoever won would take the other city-state's warriors as slaves as a kind of compensation for winning the battle. And so what this highlights is that slavery is an international problem. It's not a national problem. In other words, you can't have a policy in this day where you say, well, we're going to be the slave-free city-state. Simple. Because what that would require is a kind of isolationist economics where you say, okay, we're not going to have trade relations with any other country because any other country is going to use slaves as part of their currency and their bartering and so forth in economic relations. So the only powers at this time who could really abolish slavery would be the empires. So the Persian Empire, now they could contemplate abolishing slavery because if they did it, that would make it possible for all the smaller countries around them to do it too. And I actually think we see this in human history with the actual abolition of chattel slavery. It doesn't happen until the largest empire in the world, the British Empire, does so in the 19th century. And even then, although certainly the British Empire does it in part on the basis of principles, there's also some truth that the British Empire does it because they can do so without completely collapsing their economics in the process. In other words, it's not going to happen in earlier centuries because their economics are too woven into the practice of slave owning and trading. So we see that chattel slave abolitionism is really an international problem. And what Plato is doing here is he's saying, how do you create a regime within a city-state that tries to aim at justice for everyone? And so we do see the Athenian developing, again, a really progressive view of master-slave relations earlier in the laws because they know this is going to be an inevitability. And so whenever we think of the stuff that happens in book 11, we have to keep reminding ourselves this is a discussion of legislation in a very non-ideal context where you're just trying to get this new society up off the ground in a world where chattel slavery is so deeply embedded in the economics that no one community is going to be able to absolve it by fiat. So I just wanted to kind of say that just so that people are keeping the background of the world that's being written within here in mind, because it's a very different world than ours today.
Thank you. And that's really helpful and really actually ties, I think, to book 12, because book 12 talks about international relations and how it's important to go out and witness both the virtues and the vices of other societies. And so I think it's an interesting tie into Book 12 as well with that. But certainly, yeah, for having advocated that one should not harm slaves, one should treat them physically as if they're equals. I think that was the theory that was expressed earlier. Just the practice here is very different, I think, from the theory. So that's maybe part of the question that Clinias is being asked to face. We'll go to Darren and then Ella. Now we are at time, but since we started a little bit late, I'm hoping that we can go maybe another 15 minutes or so and wrap it up at that point. And before we close the meeting, we'll still have our offline discussion and then maybe set the stage for going into Book 12 and then in 2 weeks' time. So if that's all right, we'll go to Darren and then Ella.
So I want to take another stab at this problem of the beatings by the passerbys. And it's tied in, though, with the additional text you put on the table for us. So you read the very beginning of Book 11, that great opening where, he says, by preferring to have justice in my soul rather than money in my pocket, I'll get treasure for treasure, the better bargain, and for a better part of myself, too. And, and other things there. So I feel like this actually provides a kind of basis for why there are those kinds of regulations in the marketplace. I'll call them regulations regarding the beatings. So this is like a kind of reason for this whole section about markets and money and exchange. I think this is like the spirit that courses through this whole section, the beginning of Book 11. And so we also see a bit more later on, and I think this also provides a kind of grounding, is he talks about how the natural function, I'm quoting here, the natural function in the state of retail trading in general is not to do harm, but quite the opposite. And he talks about that the purpose of the marketplace, it seems, for this Athenian, we might just totally think this is wrong given maybe modern economics, but he thinks it's for an even distribution of goods. And he talks about anyone who creates an even distribution where you can't do any better good than that. But that's really not how we understand what we do in the market. Like, we're trying to get things for ourselves, food, basic needs. We're not even talking about luxuries here, we're trying to get something we can afford and hopefully the best price. But we're not imagining like we're trying to create an even distribution through our market transactions. But regardless, it doesn't matter what we think. This is just what the Athenians' logic is. So that's what I'm trying to understand. So so there's this idea that, we should rather have justice in my soul, and we have this thing called markets. And what are they for? For the Athenian, they're for an even distribution of goods. So I guess markets are a way for everyone to get what they need, basically. That could be one way to frame it, but, evenly. And I think the dilemma that is confronting the lawgivers here is that the people who actually do this trading in markets seems to strike them as the worst people. This is the sense I get. He talks about how, why do these people have such a terrible reputation? He asks this question, how do we explain this? So hang on, I have to read this part, because this is my favorite part of the, maybe it's my budding interest in business ethics, but I think this is the best part of Book 11, for me at least. This is at, sorry, I'm just all over the place here, 918D.
Yeah, and I have this on the screen. Actually, this was one of the readings I was going to do, but I ran out of time. So I'll just put it on the screen here as you read it.
Okay, I'll start at 918C. I'll just read a bit of that there, because it's sort of what I was talking about. So he says how, sorry, where am I?
Well, this part here I have on the screen here. It says, when goods of any kind are distributed disproportionately and equally, anyone who makes the distribution equal and even cannot fail to do good. It needs to be stated that this redistribution, in which money too plays an effective role, is precisely the purpose the trader is meant to serve.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what I was talking about. Sorry, I couldn't find the section there, so I had to sort of summarize it. Yeah. And then he says, laborers, innkeepers, workmen of varying degrees of respectability all perform the function of satisfying the needs of the community by ensuring an even distribution of goods. But then, this is the part that I think maybe explains what's going on, the dilemma that they're trying to solve here, and hence the beatings. So here is why then is trading thought to be such a low and disreputable occupation? Why has it come to be so abused? So there's a real problem here. So let's see if we can discover the reason so that we can use our legislation to reform, at any rate, some branches of commerce, even if not the whole institution. This looks like an important task that calls for exceptional resource. And Clinias is like, how do you mean? And Athenian says, my dear Clinias, only a small part of mankind, a few highly educated men of rare natural talent, is able to steel itself to moderation when assailed by various needs and desires. Given the chance to get a lot of money, it's a rare bird that's sober enough to prefer a modest competence to wealth. Most people's inclinations are at the opposite pole. Their demands are always violent demands, and they brush aside the opportunity of modest gain in favor of insatiable profiteering. That's why all branches of retailing, trade, and innkeeping suffer from abuse and extreme unpopularity. Now, here's something I'm determined to mention, ludicrous though it is. It'll never happen, and heaven help us if it did. But just picture to yourselves. So this is something that, it's hard to imagine, apparently, okay? So he says, just picture to yourselves some eminently virtuous men forced for a time to go in for innkeeping or retailing or some similar occupation, or some eminently virtuous women similarly forced by some stroke of fate to take up that kind of life, would soon realize how desirable and pleasing each of these trades really is, and if they were carried on according to honest standards, would value them all as highly as we do our mother or our nurse. But what happens? So this is like the reality now. A man goes off to some remote point on a road running through the middle of nowhere and sets up his establishment to sell provisions. He receives the weary traveler with welcome lodging, peace and quiet for the victim of violent storms, cool refreshment for the sufferer from stifling heat. But then, instead of greeting them as friends and offering them, in addition to his hospitality, some gifts as a token of goodwill, he treats them like so many enemy prisoners that have fallen into his hands and holds them to ransom for a monstrously steep and iniquitous sum. It's these and similar swindles, which are practiced in all branches of the trade, that have given the occupation of helping the worn out traveler such a bad name. And in every case, the legislator has to find a remedy. And, then it goes on.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just stop there. So anyway, I just read that just to underline that. You can really see that the people who are dealing with commerce and trading and setting up businesses like inns are like, it's a really dirty, disreputable thing. That's what makes it sound. And these are the kinds of people who deal with it. So I think, in addition to what I said earlier about the time thing and the immediacy of trading and maybe immediacy of pricing of how the marketplace is seen to work, maybe another reason anyone who spots this kind of cheating is allowed to just sort of point them out and beat them over about it. It's a primitive way, ancient way of regulating the marketplace. We have all sorts of banking regulations now, but they don't have that. So they're going to have, simply because of how the people, the most disreputable, dirty people, this is how it's being portrayed, or crafty people, are in this marketplace. It's not good enough to just report them. And how long is that going to take? You have to go to somewhere to report it. And then, by then, who knows how many goods would have been traded and what the real price is, or how prices have changed, right? Markets change all the time. So maybe the beatings is related to this, not just how markets are imagined, but how the people at this time in this ancient world who engage in profiteering and commerce, how these kinds of people are imagined. It also says at one point how, this is later on, how these pursuits are a very powerful inducements to vice. Anyway, so that's just a further additional thought. And I think it does relate to the preamble you read, or not, you didn't think it was a preamble, but the beginning of book 11. I think that provides a kind of the spirit that informs all of this discussion here, and maybe explains the beatings. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate your reading that part. It is important. And I would point out here that when he says that making the distribution equal, just from my accountant's perspective, that doesn't mean that it's like Robin Hood going and stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. It's just that every trade should be equality in every trade. That's the law of accounting. Value given equals value received. That's the law of accounting. And the problem with that is that if some sellers inflate their prices, and, I'll give a modern example. I was thinking of this yesterday. Farmer Bro, I guess this was maybe 4 or 5 years back, the guy who took over the company that had the medication that had been around for years and years, and he jacked up the price something like 1,000% for no reason other than just to profit, and he was vilified the world round I think he actually wound up going to jail for that. So I think that's maybe the kind of thing that he's talking about here, to make sure that there is fairness in the pricing so that value received is equal to value given. That's an important economic point, I think, to make there. So that's appreciated. And as you said, that kind of underlies this theory of money that's through this book as well. So I appreciate that. We are unfortunately running really out of time. So I will take it to Ella, and then maybe Ella, you can wrap up the discussion and we'll set the stage for book 12 in 2 weeks. So Ella, your thoughts?
Thank you, James, and everyone. Okay. Yeah, Plato, I seem to recall, says that without money, life is difficult. It's difficult to live a moral life. And then in the passage you just projected on the screen and read prior, James, Plato talks about distributing goods and states that he applauds this, implies that that would be fair and so forth. And yet there appears to be a contradiction. But before I go on to the contradiction, I would say that, to clarify, the poor include slaves in Athenian societies. There are 4 classes. The medics, I would assume, are also poor. They're not citizens, but they're free. They're not slaves. The slaves, I think, were captured from other islands or whatever. And you can clarify that as that's incorrect. But you have slaves, you have the medics who are not even considered citizens. You have women who can't own property. And then you have citizens. So I just want to include all of the poor when we're talking about economic justice. So on the one hand, he's saying, oh yeah, in order to be moral, you have to have money. And yeah, it's great to distribute goods and so forth. Yeah, that should be applauded. But when it gets down to the gentleman who he's speaking to about being ill and passing on, talks about distributing his property. Who's he going to distribute it to? I, as legislature, that this property belongs to you, to your own clan, to your ancestors, to your descendants. And I shall legislate with a view to notify those in interest and so forth that your property will be guarded by being distributed to your own people. Well, that is how wealth is passed along and classes are maintained, through distribution at death or through some other legal system, perhaps even while one is living, but it's passed to one's own clan. And so that's why things are kept as status quo. So I think he's contradicting himself in saying various things. Ethically, he seems to want to admit, yeah, we should be fair. We should distribute the wealth. But when it comes down to distributing the wealth to all the people so that they can have a good life and live a moral life and so forth, as he puts it, he's not going to do that at the end of the day in this particular passage. And one could argue that is the main way that wealth is passed along and classes are kept intact. Thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe part of this here is that what he's saying is that allowing somebody to leave in their will to whomever they want allows that person to enrich somebody in the future that maybe shouldn't be enriched, and takes that value out of circulation from the community. So I think it's meant to be a fairness measure. I would just, in terms of what he says about wealth, I just wanted to remind everybody, I guess, about Socrates just never having any wealth and going around unbathed and poorly clothed and all of that. And I think he's trying to say there that wealth corrupts maybe. And so this is actually, I just do this in less than 30 seconds. This is from book 8, which we skipped book 8, but I included this little bit in the notes where the Athenian is also talking about wealth. He says, the first is a passion for wealth, which makes men unwilling to devote a minute of their time to anything except their own personal property. This is what every single citizen concentrates on with all of his heart and soul. His ruling passion is his daily profit, and he's quite incapable of worrying about anything else. So he's talking about this passion for wealth that can arise in people, and he's saying that's a bad thing. So maybe this idea of inheritance that creates or furthers this wealth accumulation in the hands of a particular clan is detrimental to all the rest of the community. So I think that may be at play here. So thank you for that. Now, Darren, is it a minute, or can we hold it to the
Yeah,
next?
it's less
Yeah.
than a minute.
Okay,
I think
all
it
right.
might be 30. It might be 30 seconds. Yeah,
All right,
I
go for
wrote
it.
in the chat. I just want to fill in like a missing premise to what I said earlier. I realize it
Right.
might not make sense if I don't say this. So
Okay.
I said the beatings might make sense if we understand the kinds of people that are being imagined to be in this marketplace, like which you can tease out from the passage I read, the kinds of these bad characters are imagined to actually want to take up this work, and no one virtuous. Like it's hard to imagine anyone virtuous who would want to do this. But the beatings would make sense in this context because I think if you go back to that section I read, it's because these people, at least the way they're being imagined here, are just very motivated by pain and pleasure. And they can't resist the temptation to just profit a bit more. There's this idea that in that passage about this constant temptation to, make a bit more profit and like maybe distort the market. So, and you know how markets are just, they're constantly changing in a way. So I think the immediacy of the beatings, they might never even have to happen, right? It's just like the threat that if you try this, it's like because these people are so motivated by pain and pleasure, you just sort of need this sort of immediate punishment so that people in this sort of fast moving market won't be tempted to cheat or profiteer or whatever or distort the market. So yeah, I'm just filling in the premise that these people are just very motivated by pain and pleasure and find it difficult to resist making a bit more money. So maybe the beatings make sense in this context.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And actually recalling pain and pleasure, because that's also a major theme of the laws in the earlier books as well. Yeah, definitely people are motivated by pain and pleasure. Now, one hopes that the people administering the beatings are virtuous people, and they themselves are not motivated by some sort of pleasure from the beating, because we see, I think, people who are motivated by such a thing. So, the fact that these extrajudicial beatings are going on does concern me. So, yeah.
Maybe it just turns out the markets are so violent that no one wants to go there anymore because everyone is just randomly beating everyone.
Yeah, that's also a danger. Yeah. Well, listen, it's been a really interesting discussion today. I want to come back in 2 weeks' time and really think about how this community is getting its start and whether Clinias is actually appropriately furnished with the tools that he needs to make this a healthy, harmonious community. I think we put a lot on the table today in terms of both the economic ideas and the rules that the Athenian is setting out and the need to justify the rules. I think hopefully we've all taken something away from this, and thanks to everyone for attending. I will turn off the recording now, but invite anyone who wants to stay online for a casual unrecorded discussion. You're welcome to do so, and otherwise we'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for Book 12 in the conclusion of the laws. Thank you.